The cold was unbearable. My breath came in ragged gasps, clouds of white vapor rising into the night air. My fingers trembled as I clutched the fragile, motionless body against my chest. No. No, no, no. Snowflakes clung to her matted fur. Her ribs barely moved, each breath shallow, weak. The other tiny bodies huddled beneath her, whimpering softly. Alive, but barely. The blizzard howled around us, a wall of ice and fury, but I couldn't hear it anymore. My heart was pounding. Too loudly. I looked up, my vision blurred by tears and snow. The mother, my beautiful, brave girl, lay still. Too still. Her body shielded her puppies from the storm, but at what cost? I pressed my fingers against her chest. No heartbeat. A scream built inside me, but it never left my throat. Then, something moved in the distance, a shadow in the snow, a flicker of something impossible. I wasn't alone, and just as I opened my mouth to call for help, the ground beneath me gave way. Then, darkness. The morning had started like any other. I stepped outside, pulling my coat tighter around me as the crisp winter air nipped at my face. The snow-covered trees stretched endlessly before me, their branches weighed down by the season's latest storm. Beside me, Freya, my beautiful female. German shepherd stood proudly, her thick fur dusted with snowflakes. Her amber eyes gleamed with quiet intelligence as she nudged my hand, signaling she was ready for our morning trek. She had been restless for days now, pacing near the door, whining at odd hours. At first I thought it was because of the puppies. 5. Tiny bundles of fur, only a few weeks old. But something in her posture told me it was more than that. All right, girl, I sighed, ruffling her fur. One quick walk, then we get back to the little ones. I had no idea those would be the last calm moments we'd share. The first sign that something was wrong came just 10 minutes into our walk. Freya stopped dead in her tracks. Her ears perked up, her body tense. I followed her gaze into the tree line. But there was nothing, only snow stretching endlessly in every direction. Then I heard it, a faint, distant whimper. At first I thought it was the wind, but Freya let out a low, warning growl, the kind she only used when something wasn't right. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching against the ice. Freya, what is it? She didn't answer. Instead, she bolted. One moment she was beside me. The next she was a blur of black and tan tearing through the snow, following a scent I couldn't detect. Freya, stop! I shouted, but she didn't slow. My heart pounded as I chased after her, deeper into the thickening snowfall. The trees closed in around me, the wind howling louder, the temperature dropping fast. I wasn't sure how far we had gone when I finally caught sight of her. Standing over something half buried in the snow, I stumbled forward, breathless, my stomach twisting in dread. And that's when I saw them, tiny, fragile puppies, alone in the snow. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't Freya's litter. These were different puppies. Abandoned, freezing, dying. Freya let out a soft whimper, nuzzling the shivering bodies with her nose. She looked up at me, eyes pleading, and then, somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Something was out there, watching us. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a strange, eerie silence. My breath came in quick puffs as I knelt beside Freya, my gloved hands brushing the snow away from the tiny, trembling bodies. 5 puppies. They were barely moving, their fur crusted with ice. If we hadn't found them now, they wouldn't have lasted much longer. My heart clenched as I reached for the closest one, pressing it gently against my chest for warmth. But then, another sound. A rustling in the trees. Freya growled low in her throat, stepping protectively in front of the puppies. Her hackles rose, her ears locked onto something I couldn't see. "Who's there?" I called, my voice swallowed by the wind. No answer. But I wasn't imagining it. We weren't alone. I turned, scanning the snow-covered forest, my pulse hammering. A set of footprints led up to this spot. But there were no prints leading away. I swallowed hard. Someone had been here. Someone had left these puppies. And they were still close, I tightened my grip on the puppy in my arms and turned to Freya. "We have to get back," I whispered. She didn't move. Instead, she took a step forward, muscles tense. Her nose twitched as if she had caught a scent, something she didn't like. Then, from deep within the woods, a howl cut through the storm. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a coyote. It was something else. Freya barked sharply in response, her tail stiff, her entire body vibrating with tension. The howl came again, closer this time. It wasn't just one. My fingers trembled as I pulled my coat tighter around the shivering puppy. "Freya, let's go, now." She hesitated, just for a second, before turning and nudging the other puppies, closer to me. She knew we didn't have much time. I scooped up as many as I could, stuffing them inside my coat, their tiny bodies pressing against me for warmth. Freya picked up the last one in her jaws, cradling it gently like it was her own. Then we ran. Snow whipped against my face, the wind nearly blinding me. My boots slipped on the ice as I stumbled forward, desperate to get back to the cabin. Freya stayed close, her ears pinned back, her breath coming in fast, sharp bursts. Behind us, the howls grew louder, closer. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the trees, vibrating through the frozen ground beneath my feet. My chest tightened. That wasn't a normal animal. We weren't just being followed. We were being hunted. And then Freya stopped. My heart slammed into my ribs as I turned to see what she was looking at. There, barely visible through the snowfall, a figure stood at the edge of the trees. A shadow, motionless, watching. The puppies whimpered against my chest. Freya's lips curled back into a snarl. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. The cabin's porch light glowed like a beacon in the storm. My legs burned as I sprinted forward, nearly slipping on the dewy steps. We had made it. I kicked the door open and rushed inside, the warmth hitting me like a tidal wave. Freya followed close behind, shaking snow from her fur as I slammed the door shut and bolted it. My chest heaved as I pulled the puppies from my coat, one by one, and placed them gently on a thick wool blanket near the fireplace. They whimpered, their tiny bodies shivering, but they were alive. Freya curled around them, licking their damp fur, her eyes never leaving me. I let out a shaky breath and ran a hand through my damp hair. "We're safe," I murmured. "It's over." I almost believed it until I saw the footprints. My stomach twisted. They weren't mine. They weren't Freya's either. A fresh set of prints, larger than any humans, led from the door to the window. My pulse thundered as I turned my head, dread creeping up my spine. The curtains were open. The glass had fogged slightly from the warmth inside, but I could still make out something. Someone, standing just beyond the tree line. Blinked. The figure was still, watching. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The storm had buried most of the tracks outside, yet those prints, they were new. "Freya." My voice came out barely above a whisper. She lifted her head from the puppies, her ears twitching. Then, her body went rigid. A deep guttural growl rumbled from her throat, unlike anything I'd heard from her before. Not a warning, not fear, pure, primal rage. The fire crackled. The wind howled. And then, a knock. Not on the front door. On the window. I froze. It was slow, deliberate. 3 solid taps against the glass. Freya stood stepping in front of the puppies, her teeth bared, saliva dripping from her jaws. She didn't bark. She never barked when something was truly dangerous. My fingers trembled as I reached for the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, an old iron poker from the fireplace. I turned back to the window. The figure was gone. The snow outside was untouched, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. But as I stood there, heart hammering, one thing was clear. We weren't alone. And it wasn't over. Silence stretched across the cabin, thick and suffocating. Freya remained frozen in front of the puppies, every muscle in her body tense. Her tail was stiff, her ears pinned back. I gripped the iron poker tighter, my knuckles turning white. No footprints, No sign of anyone. Yet someone, or something, had knocked. The fire crackled, its warmth doing nothing to stop the ice spreading through my veins. My mind screamed for logic, for an explanation. Maybe the wind had thrown something against the window. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But then, I heard it. The front door handle rattled. I turned so fast I nearly dropped the poker. My breath hitched, the latch twisted. Someone was trying to get in. Freya's growl deepened, her body lowering as if ready to attack. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. The door was locked. We were safe. We had to be. Then, bang, the entire cabin shook. I gasped, my back slamming against the wall. The puppies whimpered, huddling closer to their mother. Another bang. Harder this time. The wooden frame groaned. Dust rained from the ceiling beams. Whatever was outside, it was strong. I forced myself to move, darting toward the door. My breath was shallow as I pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. Just the wind howling, the storm screaming through the trees. I swallowed hard. "Go away," I whispered, though my voice barely carried over the pounding of my heart. And then a sound so chilling it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. A low, distorted chuckle. Right outside the door. My stomach turned. My hands trembled. Freya let out a bark, a sharp warning snap that echoed through the room. Then, silence. The wind still howled. The fire still crackled, but the presence outside was gone. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My ears strained for any sign of footsteps, any hint of retreating movement. Nothing. Slowly, I uncurled my fingers from the iron poker. My knees felt weak, my body trembling from adrenaline. I turned to Freya, my voice barely above a whisper. "Think it's gone." Her ears twitched. Her gaze flicked toward the door, then she bolted. Before I could stop her, she lunged at the wooden door with all her strength, scratching and snarling like a dog possessed. Not at the door itself, but the bottom. I frowned, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I stepped forward, gripping the poker again, and lowered myself to her level. That's when I saw it, a gap, a sliver of darkness between the door and the floor, and something moving underneath. My blood turned to ice, something small, crawling. Pressing through the gap, I stumbled back, a strangled noise catching in my throat. The firelight barely illuminated it, but I could see enough. Fingers, not human, too long, too thin. The skin stretched and pale like something dead for far too long, and they were reaching inside. I did the only thing I could. I swung the poker, down with all my strength. Crack. A guttural scream tore through the cabin, inhuman, piercing. The fingers recoiled, snapping back into the darkness as if burned. Then, silence. The storm outside raged on. The door stopped shaking. The laughter was gone, but I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The storm howled louder, its icy fingers clawing at the cabin as I stood frozen in place. My heart pounded, each beat, more erratic than the last. Freya's growls slowly softened into low whines, her once alert posture now deflated with a sense of confusion. I stood motionless, staring at the gap beneath the door where the pale, twisted fingers had emerged moments ago. The tremors running through my limbs weren't from the cold. No, this was something far worse. Freya's whine pulled me from my trance. She patted over to me, nudging my leg gently with her snout, her golden eyes filled with concern. But I couldn't shake the image of those fingers, those impossible, too thin fingers pressing against the wood. What was that? The logical part of my mind screamed that it was just a trick of the storm, perhaps an animal trapped outside, or some strange occurrence in the cabin. But that didn't explain the terror that had seized me in that moment. Something was out, there, and it wasn't just the storm. I shook my head, trying to clear the haze of fear clouding my mind. I needed to think, to focus. I glanced at Freya, still watching me with those steady eyes. We weren't alone. Not anymore. I took a deep breath, making my way to the window. The blizzard outside had intensified, the snow swirling in every direction, as if the very elements were conspiring against us. The trees outside were bent under the weight of the storm, their limbs reaching toward the cabin like skeletal fingers. I turned back to the room, my eyes scanning every corner. The puppies were nestled in the corner, silent now, as if they too could sense the danger that lingered just beyond the door. I bit my lip, glancing nervously at Freya. Her body was tense, again her gaze fixed on the door with unblinking intensity. I knew that look. She had sensed something I couldn't. The fire crackled softly, but it wasn't enough to banish the chill that had crept into my bones. The unease I had felt earlier began to shift into something darker, something more profound. What was going on? What was out there? Why was Freya acting like this? A sudden idea struck me, one I hadn't considered until now. I turned to the corner of the room where my backpack rested, half open. Inside, I had a small handheld radio. Maybe, just maybe, I could get some signal. I moved, quickly, almost frantically, and grabbed it. It crackled to life in my hands as I twisted the dial, scanning for a frequency. Nothing. A wave of frustration hit me, but I didn't give up. I twisted the dial harder, desperate. Then, a voice. Is anyone out there? This is... I repeat, if you can hear this, get out. It's not safe. The storm's just the beginning. My breath caught in my throat. I snapped my head toward the window, my eyes wide with disbelief. Who was that? What did they mean? The radio crackled again. It's already inside. It's already. Here, you can't stop it, you... The voice was abruptly cut off, replaced by static. I dropped the radio as if it had burned me. My heart thudded in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Freya's growl broke the silence. She barked once, loud, sharp, urgent. Then she bolted to the door again, scratching and clawing. I followed her without thinking. What had been outside just moments ago, could it have been the same thing? That voice on the radio, it felt like a warning. A warning I hadn't understood until now. Freya, I whispered, my voice trembling. What do we do? The dog stopped at the door, standing still as if listening to something on the other side. She then turned to me, her eyes filled with a sorrowful wisdom that hit me hard. The truth began to settle in my gut, heavy and painful. The blizzard wasn't the real threat. The storm had been a cover, a means to draw us in. And those fingers, those long, pale fingers, weren't just some trick of the wind. They were a sign, a warning Freya had known. She had known long before I did. The storm outside had been orchestrated by something far darker, something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to enter the cabin and claim us. Suddenly, I understood. It had always been here. It wasn't just the weather. It wasn't just a strange occurrence. This place, the cabin, the storm, even Freya's strange behavior, had been part of something far larger, something far darker. It had followed us here. I stepped back, my pulse racing, my breath shallow. I felt as if the walls were closing in on me, the shadows stretching out of the corners of the room to wrap around me like cold, clammy fingers. Freya barked again, louder this time, more frantic. Stay close, I whispered, stay close and don't move. I backed away from the door, pulling Freya and the puppies to the corner. The radio had stopped crackling, but its final words echoed in my mind. It's already inside. And then I realized the door was never meant to keep us safe. It had been meant to keep it out. I reached for the iron poker once more. The metal felt cold in my hands. My grip tightened as I turned back to the door. It was time to face whatever had been waiting for us. My heart pounded as I stood in the corner of the cabin, the poker gripped tightly in my hands. Freya, still alert, stood by my side, her body tense, her eyes never leaving the door. The wind howled louder outside, but it felt as if everything within this small cabin had fallen into an eerie silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window sent a jolt through me. The storm had reached its peak, but there was something else now. Something heavier, darker, pressing in from all directions. Suddenly, the door handle turned, slowly, deliberately. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door, It was opening. Before I could react, the door swung open with a violent crash, splintering the old wood. A figure stood in the threshold, its form obscured by the blizzard's fury. Its face was hidden, but there was no mistaking the eerie silhouette. Long, thin fingers, like the ones I had seen moments ago, reached into the room, but this time they were followed by an arm, then another. The shadowed figure stepped into the cabin. I froze, and then a voice, soft, distorted, almost familiar, whispered, through the chaos of the storm, "You should have never tried to leave." The words made my blood run cold. I knew that voice. It was the same voice that had crackled over the radio earlier. But that couldn't be possible. How could the voice come from this thing? Freya growled low, her hackles raised. But the creature didn't flinch. It stepped closer, its movements fluid, unnatural. The air seemed to grow colder with every inch it advanced. Suddenly, everything clicked. The voice on the radio and the storm. Freya's instincts, it all made sense. This wasn't just some random force of nature. It was a presence, something ancient that had been waiting, drawing us in. And now, it was here, in front of me. I wasn't sure if it was human or something far worse, but I knew one thing. It wasn't here to help us. The creature's face emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly, sickly white in the dim light. There was something in its gaze, something predatory, something wrong. It was a face I had never seen before, yet somehow it felt too familiar. I blinked, trying to make sense of it all. But then, in the blink of an eye, it smiled, and in that moment I realized the truth. The person who had been talking to me over the radio, the warning, the storm, it wasn't meant to save us. It had always been a part of it. The final twist hit me like a punch to the gut. We had never been alone, and now the door was wide open, leaving only one question in its wake. Who was really the hunter, and who was the prey? The storm outside raged, but it felt distant now, like a memory fading into the background. Inside the cabin, the air had grown thick, saturated with an unspoken terror. The creature, whatever it was, stood at the door, its eyes glowing in the dim light, its smile an eerie mask that mocked everything I had ever believed about survival. Had thought the worst had already passed, that we were safe in the cabin, that the storm was our enemy. But no. The storm was nothing compared to the nightmare standing before us. Freya stood at my side, her body taut with readiness, every muscle coiled in preparation. I could feel her warmth, her loyalty, her devotion. Despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I found some semblance of comfort in her presence. She was still here. She was still fighting for me, for us. For a brief moment I thought back to the days before this nightmare had started, before we had found ourselves trapped in the wilderness. It seemed so simple then. My life had been simple. I had a routine. I knew where I was headed every day. I knew who I was. I was a man with goals, with plans, but now everything was shattered. The world I knew had dissolved into chaos, replaced by something I couldn't even begin to understand. I had tried to fight back against the storm, tried to make sense of the twisted, growing tension in the air. But none of that mattered now. The creature, the storm. It was all part of something much larger, something far more terrifying than I could ever have imagined. Freya growled again, her eyes locked on the figure, but I could see the hesitation in her stance. She too had finally understood the truth. This wasn't just a creature of the night or a wild animal seeking shelter. It was something worse, something older, something tied to the very land itself. The figure took another step forward, its presence pulling the air from the room. My heart raced, each beat loud in my ears as the cabin seemed to close in around us. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against me as if they were alive, shifting with the weight of the moment. I looked down at Freya, her fur still thick with snow and ice, her tail tucked in just slightly, the only sign of fear she had shown since this all began. Her bravery had never wavered, even when everything else did. She was the only constant in this ever-changing nightmare. She was my lifeline. I had to protect her, just as she had protected me. I knew I couldn't keep running from the storm forever. I had to face it, just as Freya had faced every danger before us, no matter how impossible. We would fight. We would survive, together. I stepped forward, my legs trembling, but my resolve strengthening with every breath. The figure's eyes followed me, cold and calculating. It was studying me, waiting for me to break. But I wouldn't. Not this time. The creature spoke again, its voice softer now, almost soothing. You can't run forever. You're part of this now, just like her. I froze. The words hit me like a slap in the face. I looked down at Freya, my heart tightening with fear and love. What did it mean? What was it talking about? The creature seemed to sense my confusion, its smile widening ever so slightly. It raised a hand, and suddenly, Freya stiffened. Her eyes locked onto its gesture. My breath caught in my throat. No, I whispered. No, you won't take her. But before I could reach for Freya, before I could stop whatever was happening, the creature's hand dropped, and there was a sudden flash of light. It felt as though the world itself had fractured. I looked down at Freya. Her eyes, her loyal, devoted eyes, were no longer filled with fear. Instead, they were full of understanding. She had accepted it. She knew what I didn't yet understand. The storm outside ceased its fury. The wind died down, and for the briefest of moments, everything was still. Then, in that moment of complete silence, something shifted in the air. Freya's tail, once tense with anticipation, lowered slowly, as though the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. She looked at me one last time, her eyes full of peace, as if to say goodbye. I didn't understand what had happened. I didn't know what had changed, but I knew that somehow it was over. The creature's presence faded into the background, leaving only a lingering sense of something ancient and powerful that had been satisfied. Freya was no longer by my side. The emotional storm inside me began to unravel as the reality of the situation sank in. The loss was immediate and all-encompassing, but it wasn't just the loss of my faithful companion. It was the loss of something even deeper. Freya had been my anchor, my rock. But now, in her absence, I realized that I had to face the world without her. And yet, as I stood in the quiet aftermath, I couldn't help but feel that Freya hadn't truly left me. She had given me the strength to survive. She had fought for me until the very end. And in that moment, I understood. The bond we shared was unbreakable. It transcended everything, the storm, the creature, even death itself. As I stepped outside, into the now calm night, I felt her presence in every corner of the world around me. The snow was falling softly, gently, like a blanket wrapping the earth in peace. The storm had passed, but the memory of Freya, of her unwavering love and sacrifice, would stay with me forever. I was no longer just a man alone in the wilderness. I was a man who had learned the true meaning of survival. And as I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, I realized that in the face of everything, I had been changed. And somehow, I knew she would never truly leave me. Freya had saved me, and now I would carry her memory with me always. As I looked up at the dark sky, I whispered her name into the wind, hoping somehow she could hear me. Thank you, Freya.